Open the official diagnostic record, look for psychopath. It is not there. Look for sociopath. It is not there either. Yet those two words are everywhere. In documentaries, in court reporting, in police commentary, in almost every true crime comment section. The public thinks they describe two different people. One cold, one chaotic, one born, one made. One plans, one snaps. It sounds clean. That is why it survived. But the record says something else. Psychopath and sociopath are not two official diagnoses. They are not separate clinical species. They are overlapping labels. And the real term sits somewhere else. Antisocial Personality Disorder. That is where the myth begins. Because the public uses three words as if they are interchangeable. Psychopath, sociopath, antisocial. They are not the same thing. One is a formal diagnosis. One is a forensic construct. One is mostly cultural shorthand. That difference matters, because these labels are not harmless. They shape fear. They shape headlines. They shape how juries listen. They shape how danger is imagined. And often, they are used badly. The public version is simple. Too simple. The official record is colder and more useful. Antisocial personality disorder is the diagnosis. It is built around behaviour, repeated law-breaking, deceit, impulsivity, aggression, reckless disregard for safety, irresponsibility, lack of remorse. Not one cruel act, not one toxic relationship, not one unpleasant personality. A pattern. That word matters. A pattern across time, a pattern across settings, a pattern across consequences. Just like a case file. One page can mislead. The whole record tells more. The person must be an adult. There must usually be earlier signs, often before the age of 15. That does not mean every troubled child becomes dangerous. It means the trail often starts early. Conduct problems, violence, cruelty, theft, fire setting, persistent rule breaking. Not as a horror checklist, as warning signs. The record is not asking who looks frightening. It asks what keeps happening. That is the diagnosis. Psychopathy is different. Psychopathy is not mainly a diagnosis label. It is a trait pattern. It concerns personality, emotion, control, fear, guilt, empathy, manipulation. It asks a different question. Not only what did the person do, but how do they use other people? That is why psychopathy became important in forensic settings. The best known tool is the PCL-R, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. It has 20 items, not one stare, not one smirk, not one calm interview, 20 scored areas. Superficial charm, grandiosity, lying, manipulation, lack of remorse, shallow emotion, callousness, poor behavioural control, impulsivity, early behaviour problems, criminal versatility. But this is not a parlour trick. It needs trained assessment. Interviews, records, collateral information. A person is not a psychopath because they seemed cold on camera. That is television, not evidence. The problem is that television won. Psychopath became a costume. The blank stare, the calm voice, the perfect suit, the strange smile, the neighbour who seemed normal. But none of that proves anything. Shock can look cold. Fear can look flat. Trauma can look detached. Medication can blunt expression. Neurodivergence can be misread. And guilty people can perform grief. The face is not the record. The history is. That is where the true crime often gets lazy. A suspect does not cry. Psychopath. A killer lies. Sociopath. A murderer plans. Psychopath. A murderer panics. Sociopath. The label arrives before the evidence. That is not investigation. That is branding. Now look at sociopathy. This word is even less stable. It is usually used for socially shaped antisocial behaviour. Environment, neglect, violence, peer influence. Trauma. A childhood where rules failed. A home where fear did the parenting. That is the rough meaning. But rough is the important word. Sociopathy is not a clean medical category. It is a descriptive shortcut. People often use it for someone more explosive, more impulsive, more reactive, more visibly unstable. The psychopath is imagined as controlled. The sociopath is imagined as volatile. That is the popular divide. Cold predator, hot offender. But real cases do not divide like that. A person can be controlled and impulsive, charming and violent, calculated in one setting, chaotic in another, attached to one person, predatory towards everyone else. Human harm does not respect labels. That is the second problem. The public wants types. The evidence gives patterns. So what is the difference? The cleanest answer to this, Antisocial Personality Disorder, is the clinical diagnosis. Psychopathy is a measured trait construct. Sociopathy is loose cultural shorthand. That is the spine. Everything else is commentary. Psychopathy usually points towards emotional and interpersonal traits. Callousness, manipulation, shallow affect, low remorse, low fear, predatory control. Sociopathy usually points towards instability and social damage. Impulsivity, anger, chaotic behaviour, unstable attachments, environmental roots, but usually is doing heavy work. Remove that word and the claim breaks, because these are not separate species. They are overlapping descriptions. That is why the myth is dangerous. It makes people think danger has a style. A neat criminal is a psychopath. A messy criminal is a sociopath. A charming abuser is a psychopath. An angry abuser is a sociopath. That sounds useful. It is often aesthetic sorting. The record asks better questions. Does the person repeatedly lie? Do they exploit others? Do they ignore consequences? Do they show remorse? Does remorse change their behaviour? Do they control through fear? Do they escalate when challenged? Do they enjoy domination? Those questions produce evidence. The labels often stop evidence. There is another distortion: violence. Most people hear psychopath and imagine murder. A serial killer, a predator, a corpse. The camera loves that version. But antisocial traits can appear without murder. Fraud, coercion, financial abuse, repeated deceit, workplace exploitation, domestic control, risk-taking that endangers others, cruelty without visible blood. The corpse gets the headline, the pattern usually came first. That is the part people miss. Harm often arrives dressed as normal life. A relationship, a business deal, a friendship, a charming introduction, a plausible excuse, then another, then another. The mask is not always elegance. Sometimes the mask is routine. That is why labels can mislead. People look for the monster. They miss the method. The record does not ask whether someone feels evil. It asks what they do when others suffer. That distinction matters, because empathy is often misunderstood. The myth says psychopaths feel nothing. That is too simple. Some people read emotion very well. They know what fear looks like. They know what shame does. They know where pressure hurts. The issue is not always blindness. Sometimes it is use. They see the lever, then they pull it. That is more dangerous than the stereotype suggests. The evidence says something narrower. Some show shallow emotional response, some show reduced fear, some show poor guilt. Some understand suffering intellectually, but it does not restrain them. That is not simple emptiness, it is disconnection. A wire cut between recognition and restraint. With sociopathy, the myth is different. The sociopath feels too much. Too much anger, too much threat, too much reaction. There may be attachments, but unstable ones. There may be loyalty, but narrow loyalty. There may be guilt, but inconsistent guilt. Again, this is not a formal border. It is a rough description, and rough descriptions become dangerous when treated as verdicts. There is also a moral problem. These words turn people into objects. Psychopath, sociopath, monster. Once the label is applied, the file closes. No context, no assessment, no record, no responsibility for accuracy. The word becomes the verdict. That is not careful. It is convenient. This matters in crime coverage, but it also matters outside crime. People use these labels after breakups, in workplace disputes, in family arguments, in comment sections. Sometimes they are describing real harm. Sometimes they are describing cruelty. Sometimes they are describing abuse. But the behaviour still matters most. They lied, they manipulated, they threatened, they isolated someone, they took money, they ignored consent, they showed no change. Those facts matter more than the label. A named behaviour can be challenged. A mythic label fogs the room. The forensic world has another risk. Psychopathy scores can influence decisions. Prison management, parole, treatment planning, public protection, that can be necessary, but it must be handled carefully. A score is not a soul. A checklist is not destiny. It is information, and information needs context. No single tool tells the whole person. No label predicts every future act. Risk is not prophecy. It is probability under conditions. Change the conditions and risk can change. Ignore the conditions and risk can grow. That is why the born versus made myth fails. Biology matters. Temperament matters. Fear response may matter. Inheritance can matter, but environment matters too. Neglect, violence, instability, substance abuse, head injury, peer groups, school exclusion, early conduct problems. None of this excuses harm. Explanation is not absolution, but it makes the pattern traceable. And traceable is useful, because what can be traced can sometimes be interrupted. The monster story gives us fear. The record gives us leverage. That is less dramatic. It is also more honest. Treatment is difficult. Nobody serious pretends otherwise. But difficult does not mean impossible. Often the goal is harm reduction. Less violence, less substance abuse, better impulse control, stable housing, clear consequences, fewer victims. The public wants a confession scene. The clinical record wants less damage. That is the quieter truth. So why do the old words survive? Because they simplify fear. Psychopath gives us the cold predator. Sociopath gives us the dangerous outsider. Both words feel useful. Both words feel final. They turn uncertainty into category. They turn behaviour into identity. They make complex harm easier to narrate. That is why documentaries use them. That is why headlines use them. That is why viewers remember them. A label travels faster than a record, but faster is not better. The record is slower. It asks for history. It asks for repetition. It asks for context. It asks what happened before. It asks what happened after. It asks whether consequences changed anything. That is the real difference. Not psychopath versus sociopath, evidence versus shorthand. So the verdict is this: psychopath and sociopath are not two official diagnoses. They are overlapping labels. Psychopathy is the better studied construct. Sociopathy is the looser cultural term. Antisocial Personality Disorder is the formal diagnosis. The internet version says the difference is simple. Cold versus hot. Planned versus chaotic. Born versus made. The documented record says otherwise. Diagnosis is behaviour. Psychopathy is traits. Sociopathy is shorthand. The rest is television. And television was never the record.